Pan-Arabism in Egypt, from Nassar through the Arab Spring. An agreement over Britain's strategic position in Egypt was reached in 1954, requiring British forces to be withdrawn from the Canal Zone. Under its terms, the British could reactivate the military base in the event of an armed conflict in the region. Nevertheless, it provided Egypt with an opportunity to pursue a policy of non-alignment with other non-aligned states. And, therefore, the ability to focus on achieving the primary aim of the revolution, to end the exploitation. To achieve this goal, Nassar sought to industrialize Egypt, with the Aswan High Dam to serve as a keystone project. However, with the country's economy dominated by Western powers, and Western financial institutions unwilling to provide the loans necessary to finance the project, Nassar had to rely on other means of achieving his vision. He argued in a July 26, 1956, speech that nationalizing the Suez Canal Company would be not only just, but would contribute to the goal of ending exploitation in the country. This move affirmed Nassar's role as a leader among the newly independent states of the Middle East and North Africa, but provoked a sharp response from Britain and France. Nassar's agenda, however, was not only challenged through such overtly bellicose tactics, but also by the precipitous spread of subversive political ideologies. In particular, Baathism, which combined the language of religion with that of social justice, and substituted a form of pan-Arab socialism for national sovereignty. The Arab Ba'ath Party, which was formed in Damascus in 1947, resonated with the new educated class, and could appeal to communities outside the Sunni Muslim majority. In 1952, it merged with the Arab Socialist Movement led by Akram al-Harani to form the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party in Syria. Within this more accessible expression, Ba'athist ideology spread throughout the region, and the newer adherents of Ba'athism supported more actionable and reform-driven policies than their predecessors. The proliferation of Ba'athist ideology was halted for a while by the immense popularity of Nassar throughout the Arab world, which contributed to the establishment of a union state with Syria, and a federal union with the Kingdom of Yemen, from 1958 to 1961. While initially supported by the Ba'ath Party in Syria due to the threat of a communist takeover, the Ba'ath Party's enthusiasm for the union quickly faded as the government of the United Arab Republic prevented Ba'ath Party members from holding prominent positions, and the union was dissolved by disaffected members of the Syrian armed forces. Later, the military wing of the party clashed with the civilian faction led by Michel Aflaq, and in Syria, as in neighboring Iraq, ultimately the military faction solidified power. Although Egypt did not have a prominent Ba'ath Party of its own, historians in Egypt had begun interpreting nationalist movements in Marxist terms, depicting a struggle between particular classes. Social justice advocates demanded that culture reflect the whole nature and situation of a society, and that every effort be made to present the relationship of the individual with the experience of his society. In order to spread power evenly, they argued, those in power must speak the political language of the groups that they represent, a process leading to the degeneration of culture. And in the 1950s and 60s, the idea emerged of Islam being a religion of social justice. While Nassar presented a version of Arab socialism in the National Charter of 1962. Such terms as socialism and social justice referred only to reform of the system of land tenure, the extension of social services, and universal education. Furthermore, the Arab Socialist Union was created to be the sole means of representing the various group interests within the population. And, while he emphasized his country's role as part of the Arab world, he also presented himself as its natural leader. Nassar termed his program of social reform in religious terms as a bridge between Marxism and capitalism. Political democracy, Nassar argued, was impossible without social democracy, which involved public ownership of communications and other public services, as well as banks and insurance companies, large industries, healthcare, and foreign trade. For Nassar, capitalism led to domination by the classes that owned the means of production. However, as various groups representing disparate interests within the country demanded that the government do more to represent their particular classes. From 1967 onward, class differences in Egypt were stressed much more, with a greater emphasis placed on religion. Yet, Marxists criticized Arab socialism as falling short of scientific socialism, as based upon a recognition of the differences and conflicts of classes, and religious extremist groups, like the Muslim Brothers, accused the state of using the language of Islam to hide a secular agenda. Act 2, the post-1970 open-door policy. Nassar's vision of Pan-Arabism was dealt another blow when Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, asked Russia to withdraw its advisors and technicians. While the army remained largely Russian-equipped and trained, this move signaled an end to Nassar's policy of neutrality. This change of course was marked by a new constitution in 1971, which allowed for greater liberalization of the economy. In 1973, Sadat led Egypt into a war with Israel, a war intended to compel the Western powers into negotiating a settlement between the Arabs and Israelis. As American policymakers, at the time, attempted to balance support for Israel with other regional Cold War objectives. The Infida policy of the open door signaled a change in the attitudes and policies of most Arab governments towards the West. An Egypt-Israel peace treaty was signed in 1979, and in the following years, through American mediation, Israel withdrew from some of the territories it had conquered in 1967 and 1973. While Egypt opened up to foreign investment and enterprise, the wealthy oil-producing Gulf countries set up funds for the poorer countries in the region. And the Egyptian government increasingly viewed migration as beneficial to economic growth, and household economy grew more dependent on Egyptians living abroad. But even as Egyptian oil exports increased, living standards for most working-class Egyptians were declining. In 1977, Egypt experienced deadly bread riots as Sadat canceled the subsidization of certain industries to satisfy the World Bank. The Soviet Union's influence within the Near East, which had generally been waning, was making a resurgence due to the social, economic, and political turmoil in the region. And, on the 25th of May 1981, the Charter of the Gulf Company Operation Council, consisting of all Arab states of the Persian Gulf, was signed with the backing of the Soviet Union and its allies. Later that year, President Sadat was assassinated. Act 3, the period of interdependence. Under Sadat's successor, Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's relations with the United States grew even closer. Egypt was expelled from the Arab League, which moved its headquarters from Cairo to Tunis. The Egyptian model of the 1980s encouraged patron-client relationships that fostered personal interest in maintaining the regime. A system that was bolstered by economic migrants to other countries, who favored stability at home. By the early 1980s, there were almost double the number of government officials as workers employed in productive industry, which, with the exception of industries involved with the production of armaments, declined, increasing polarization within society. The government's means of control, intelligence, security services, the bureaucracy, and the growth of interdependency as exists within a modern state, could mitigate social unrest. However, it could not halt the growth of extremist religious groups throughout the 1980s. The growth of participation in the electoral process, the emergence of a mass media, and the ruralization of the cities, all contributed to the elevation of the Islamic language within political discourse, to an extent greater than at any time since independence. Religious political groups like the Muslim Brothers appealed to those disenfranchised from the new economy. Different facets of the government, the party, the army, and the intelligence services, competed for resources and influence and promoted their own agenda. And Nassar's focus on economic development was largely replaced by a preoccupation with institutional reform and securing a structured transfer of power. As Egypt's influence within the region declined, that of the oil-rich Gulf countries burgeoned. While one group of countries, recognizable by their free, capitalist economy, gravitated toward the U.S. Regional, political, and social antagonisms, such as from the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 1988, ensured the political isolation of the other. Namely Algeria, Libya, Syria, Iraq, South Yemen, and the PLO. Furthermore, the question of Palestine and the plight of the Palestinians had lost much of its ability to unite Arab states, as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict entered a new phase in 1988. Whereas, previously, the PLO had been largely subject to Egyptian oversight, as the PLO assumed more control over its affairs, it had to consider the opinion of the Palestinians, and many of whom wanted to end the occupation and negotiate a settlement with Israel. The coup de grace. Radical Islamic political groups coordinated a grassroots strategy to attain power by any means possible. And in the 1984 parliamentary elections, some members of an opposition party, a revival of the pre-independence Wafd party, allied with the Muslim Brotherhood. Later, after Mubarak disbanded parliament, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had developed alliances with the Labour and Liberal parties for the 1987 parliamentary elections, used the professional syndicates to help mobilize the professional class. While Mubarak managed to retain control for a time, and Operation Desert Storm in 1991 included Arab forces from Egypt, extremist elements were growing more powerful. From 1995, the regime worked tirelessly to suppress the increasing influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, but by 2000, it formed the largest opposition in parliament. The regime had agreed to popular institutional reforms and to implementing new electoral laws designed to increase participation in elections. Nevertheless, in 2011, Egypt succumbed to the cycle of Islamist revolt and state repression that has plagued most of the region. In 2013, the military intervened to stabilize the situation, and in 2014, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was sworn in as president. What does the future hold for Egypt, and can it succeed in fulfilling the aims of the 1952 revolution? What are your thoughts?